Pokemon, in general, can be kind of tricky to figure out when it comes to how social they are. There are plenty of Pokemon that like to flock together and form large groups in their own territory, but you'll also get the ones that just want to fight everything and defend their own turf with all that they have. Spearow sits squarely in the latter category. This little bird will fiercely defend any scrap of land that it considers to be its own. Hello and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides. Today, we'll be going over the small bird Pokemon Spearow and its evolution, the long-flying Pokemon Spearow. They are originally from the Kanto region, and while not as widespread or common as its counterpart Pidgey, they have become a fairly common sight across all the regions. Spearow is a small bird, only averaging a foot tall and weighing in about 4 pounds. They have this wild, spiky look around their head made of brown feathers, but their back is actually black in color and their wings are red. Really, they have a strange menagerie of colors on them. Spearow loses that mix of colors, however, instead having nearly an entirely brown body and wings, with lighter accents at the tip of the feathers, as well as a red frock that stands up from the top of its head. Also, its beak has become pretty long, and it has jumped up in size, now being almost 4 feet tall and 84 pounds. That is a massive jump in one evolution, and Spearow put the new bulk and size to good use, using their massive wings to help keep them in the air for long periods of time. Letting them get that exercise will be a big part of keeping and raising one of these Pokemon. But we can get into all of that later on in the care guide. For now, let's see if these birds are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. To be entirely honest, a lot of this care guide is going to be the same as the Pidgey care guide, like the enclosures. With how Spearow is the same size and weight as a Pidgey, and Spearow, while shorter, is the same weight and, more importantly, has the same wingspan as a Pidgeot, their space requirements are the exact same. So, if this seems a little familiar, it's just a repeat of what I said in the Pidgey care guide. For those who haven't seen that video, something to remember is that bird Pokemon need space to fly. It's a required part for their life cycle, and they need it for the proper physical development of their bodies. But if we were to build an enclosure that was large enough for all these fully evolved flying types to fly around inside the enclosure, then you'd be encasing entire neighborhood blocks inside of your Pokemon's enclosure. Since that is entirely unrealistic outside of a zoo, we will be describing enclosures that your Pokemon lives in, but that they will also need to be let out of to be able to fly around and work their wings. And that means that training is a large part of the care for your bird Pokemon, which we will go over later on. So the first small thing that I want to go over with you is the type of environment that the Spearow line tends to live in when in the wild. The Spearow and Spearow can both be found in grassland environments, places that have tall grasses that allow them to both use their feathers to blend in. Well, it allows Spearow to blend in at least. Spearow's black and red might make it stand out a bit more. But either way, they are built for more warm environments, places that get warm summers and mild winters. If you live in a place like that, then you won't have to worry about the temperature. But if you don't live in a place like that, then you'll have to make arrangements to make sure that your Pokemon is not adversely affected by the cold winters. Especially Spearow, since, as you'll see in a bit, they will be living outside. So you may have to make some adjustments to your enclosure so that the weather doesn't affect them overmuch. After all, I'm sure you don't like being stuck outside in a bad rainstorm or snowstorm, and I can guarantee you that these Pokemon won't like it either. Now, of course you'll need the basic stuff for flying-type Pokemon. A water dish or a spigot, perches spread around the enclosure for them to sit on, and a feeding dish for their food somewhere in the enclosure. But space is the biggest requirement for flying-type Pokemon of all kinds. A good rule of thumb when buying an enclosure for the smaller bird Pokemon is that the width and length of it should be at least 1.5 times the wingspan of your flying-type Pokemon. Based on the average height and weight of a Spearow, you'll most likely get one with a wingspan around 3 feet, meaning you'll have to get an enclosure that is at least 4.5 feet in all dimensions, almost like the size of a large dresser. That'll be plenty of room for your Spearow to flit around and jump from wall to wall in its enclosure. Oh, and I should mention that you can get these enclosures from most Pokemon shops, or even order them online. But remember that I said that the enclosure is only part of these Pokemon's habitat, and that they will need to be let out to stretch their wings. Now, since you'll also be doing the Pokemon's training, I wouldn't keep your Spearow outside. Untrained flying-type Pokemon will just return to the wild just like any other Pokemon, but they're much harder to keep contained when training, as they can just fly away. To prevent this, I would suggest keeping the enclosure in a larger room in your house, and to let your Pokemon get the exercise that it needs, I would let it fly and flit around the room, with your supervision of course. This will give you the safe space to train your Pokemon to return to you without worrying about them flying off. Of course, I won't tell you how to decorate your house, it's your space. But whatever room that you're letting your Spearow fly around in, I wouldn't put too many breakable things in it, as a small bird flying and flapping around can lead to plenty of broken items. With how sassy Spearow can be in the beginning, I would expect more damage to things than from other Pokemon like this, like P-Dove or Pidgey. Once your Spearow evolves, it'll be far too large to be let out in your house. After all, a Spearow has a 10-foot wingspan to carry its bulk through the air. And to house that bulk, you're going to need a massive enclosure. One that is way too big to fit in all but the biggest houses. Like I said in the Pidgey Care Guide, for larger birds, the 1.5 wingspan rule for the enclosure size kinda doesn't work. It tends to produce enclosures that are a tad too small for them. So I would get an enclosure built that is 25 feet by 25 feet in the ground and 20 feet tall. It'll take up a lot of space, don't get me wrong, but it's what's needed when you have something as big as a Spearow, and that would be just to give it enough space to live in. You still have to let it out to give it time to fly and exercise. Unfortunately, due to the semi-permanent nature of these enclosures, you won't really find them for sale anywhere, online or in person. You will have to call in a company that'll build the enclosure custom just for you. The good part about this is that they often include everything that you need, from the watering system to the food dish and even the nesting area. It's all taken care of when these companies come in to build your enclosure for you. And because this enclosure is so big, there will be a door on one side of the enclosure, so that you can enter to either feed or interact with your Spearow, or you can let the Spearow out to fly and stretch its wings. The last thing to talk about with the enclosure is the territorial nature. So far, both of the bird Pokemon species that we've covered have both been territorial, but Pidgey has nothing on Spearow. While the enclosure I've described is only sized for one Pokemon, Spearow evolutions do well when paired with each other. Spearow are usually found in the wild in large flocks, and Spearow in smaller numbers, usually ranging from 2 individuals to up to around 6. But, and I want to be very clear on this, they can be very aggressive toward other types of Pokemon. You should house nothing but other Spearow line evolutions with them. Any other flying types is an immediate no, as your Spearow and Fearow will see them as competition for the territory. You'll end up having some aerial battles that you should honestly try to avoid, because it could end up with one or both of your Pokemon getting unnecessarily hurt. And we of course want to avoid that as much as possible. Bug types are also a no, as they are the main prey of Spearow and Fearow in the wilds, so keeping them together is just a recipe to end up losing your bug Pokemon. Nobody wants to walk outside and see their Caterpie missing and their Spearow looking suspiciously plump. Electric types are also a bad idea, as if they get into a battle, they'll zap your flying type Pokemon out of the air the instant they start a fight. And grass types are nearly as vulnerable to them as bug types. I could keep going on, but I think you get my point. Anything that you house with them will eventually get into a fight with them. Availability. Unlike a lot of other Pokemon lines, where the latter evolution stages are unavailable either because of the ecological competition between the evolved Pokemon, the difficulty in keeping and breeding them, or because the people that have one simply want to keep it, Spearow is actually readily available. Like I said, in the wild, Spearow form large flocks, larger in the Kanto region than in other regions, but still. So as long as you're in the correct area, you should be able to find one. And since Spearow also form flocks, there isn't as much competition between them as other fully evolved Pokemon, so they can be in more abundance in any area they live in. Finding them in the wild isn't too hard to do, so long as you don't live in the Hoenn or Galar regions. In those regions, there are currently no wild populations of Spearow or Spearow. But something to keep in mind is that I do not recommend wild caught with this species. Wild Pokemon can have a territorial streak, and if you get a wild Spearow, I'm just gonna wish you good luck. It's very tough and much more dangerous to try and change a fully evolved Pokemon's behavior than it is to change a young Pokemon's behavior. But the good news on that end is that Spearow is such a common Pokemon that there are plenty of breeders out there that raise and breed them. They can be harder to find than other flying type Pokemon like Pidgey and Taillow because of the hours the breeder will need to put into training all of their breeding pairs, but to those that are persistent, you'll be able to find a Spearow or even a Spearow from a breeder relatively easily. Care. Honestly, the care for Spearow and Spearow is really like any of the other normal flying types out there. The only thing with these birds is that I would put an special emphasis on the training. It is much more important to make sure that these birds are trained than almost any other flying type. Well, maybe a Taillow, but they aren't territorial so much as too brave for their own good. Anyway, back to Spearow. Like I said, the care for this one is nearly the same as any other bird's care, but I'll still run through it for those that just came here to find out how to raise their Spearow. A cleaning will be the easiest part of this, so let's talk about that first. You'll have to make sure that the enclosures stay in good, clean condition, which means scrubbing away things like leftover food, droppings, and any other mess that your Pokemon makes. During molting season, and occasionally all year round, a feather sweep up will be an important part of it as well. They can get kinda gross if you leave them in the enclosure for too long. Then refill the water and make sure everything is all set the way that it should be, and you should be good with cleaning. Food will be a basic thing to handle as well. Spearow and Spearow both are carnivores, so you will need to get some meat feeders for them. There are two ways that you could get those. One is that you could raise the feeders yourself. That'll make things easier for you cost-wise in the long run, but that isn't for everyone. What many people do instead is that they order their feeders from breeders online, and they get a shipment of them frozen. Then, when you go to feed your Pokemon, you just thaw out the amount that you need. As for the types of prey, in the wild, Spearow eat bug Pokemon, small ones. So the best thing to order for them would be Caterpie, since it's what their usual natural prey would be in the wild. Defrost about 3 or 4 ounces twice a day, one of which will be used in training, which I'll get to in a second. Usually when a species evolves, I would have you swap out what kind of food you feed your Pokemon, like I did with the Pidgey line. But in the wild, both Spearow and Spearow feed off the same prey, meaning that I would keep using the Caterpie feeders instead of switching out for something like Magikarp. Instead, you'll only have to up the amount of food that they get, up to 4 pounds for a fully grown Spearow. It seems like a lot, but you have to remember that these are massive birds, and they require a lot of caloric intake to be able to lift and keep themselves in the air. And now we come to what is probably the most important part of this care guide: training. Granted, the entire thing is important, but with how aggressive these Pokemon species can be, training is the kind of thing that could potentially keep you or your Pokemon from getting injured. Let me also preface this with the fact that I have never cared for a bird Pokemon myself. I just don't find them terribly interesting, and they require so much investment and training to care for effectively. So, I am by no means an expert in this training method. I did some research online for a couple days and compiled what I believe is an effective training strategy. But if you are serious about getting one of these flying type Pokemon, then I would highly suggest finding and talking to an actual flying type trainer that can give you a proper rundown of a good training regimen. Got it? Okay. Now that the disclaimers are out of the way, let's talk about training. You'll need a bit of equipment first before we get started. That will be a Pokemon whistle, some padded clothing and a face mask, one of the 2 meals that I mentioned earlier, and a flying Pokemon perch that is rated to a Spearow's weight. You could get one that'll just handle a Spearow, but in the long run you'll end up having to replace that with a Spearow stand anyway, so it'll save you money just to buy the Spearow one right away. Now that you have the equipment and your Pokemon, set the stand up in the same room that you'll be housing your Pokemon in. Place one of the bits of food on the perch, release your Spearow to fly around the room, and step back from the enclosure and the perch. Make sure you have the Pokemon whistle at the ready because as soon as the Pokemon lands on the perch to get the food, give a sharp, short toot on the whistle. Then wait till your Pokemon takes off from the perch to start flying around the room again, and place another bit of food on the perch. Rinse and repeat. Now, this stage is where the padded clothing and face mask come into play. Like I've been saying, Spearow is a very territorial species, so when you release it, it might not take too kindly to you being in the room with it. And, unfortunately, that means that it might start pecking and beating its wings at you. The padded clothing will keep this from injuring you, but this is also why I always recommend having a Pokeball connected to any Pokemon you keep. If your Spearow does start to become aggressive towards you, then return it to its Pokeball and return it to its enclosure. Give it half an hour to calm down, then re-enter the room and try again. The idea is that the Pokemon will eventually become accustomed to you being in the room with it. It won't happen right away, but over time it should become more docile towards you. It'll just be a lot of patience and a lot of effort in the meantime. Once your Pokemon becomes more amenable to you being in its space, then keep placing the food on the perch and whistling when it lands to eat the food. Eventually, the Pokemon will start to associate the sound of the whistle with getting food. After a few weeks, reverse the process. When you let your Pokemon out of their enclosure, don't put the food on the perch. Instead, while your Pokemon is flying around the room, blow the whistle first. If your Pokemon has been conditioned to the sound, they'll land on the perch, and if they do this, then reward them with the food. If they do not, wait a minute, then blow the whistle again. It may take a few blows for them to land on the perch, but that's fine. This stage of the training is really just to reinforce that conditioning. If you end up blowing on the whistle 5 times and your Spearow still ends up ignoring you, then use the Pokeball to return them to the enclosure and shut out all the lights from the room. Close off all the windows, shut off all the lights, and close the door. Then keep it like this for about an hour. Doing this will fool your Spearow into thinking that night has come, and essentially simulate going to bed without dinner, showing that not listening to the whistle will have consequences. Then, after that hour, return to the room and try the training again. Keep trying this a couple times, and if they still do not listen after a few times of being sent to bed, then end the training session and do not give the rest of the food to your Spearow. Of course, I do not recommend not feeding your Pokemon at all. That's why I said to feed Spearow twice a day. That way they get a full meal at least once a day. Never, ever underfeed your Pokemon. Ever. Okay. As time goes on and you continue doing the training, then your Spearow should start to respond to the whistle more and more, until it responds and lands on the perch every time. When you get to that point, start scaling back the rewards slowly. That way they don't expect food every time, but still listen to the whistle commands. This training will also start to strengthen the bond between you and your Pokemon, which is another very important part of your relationship. Eventually, they will return to the perch without the food reward being needed. Of course, once your Pokemon evolves, you won't be able to let your Spearow loose in your house, and that's where the training becomes very important. Spearow like to and need to take very long flights during the day, and of course those long flights can't happen in its enclosure. You'll have to let them fly outside, and that's why the return training is so important. Pokemon that aren't trained to return to their owners tend to just fly off into the wild, and you wouldn't want that. So when your Spearow is out flying around, have the perch that you've been using so far set up near its enclosure. Give it some time to get the exercise that it needs and then blow the whistle. If you got a good Pokemon whistle, then it should hear it just fine, even if it's high up in the air. Then, thanks to the effort that you put in while it was still a Spearow, it should return to the perch. Now, like I said, this is a very basic guide to training your flying Pokemon to return to you. There are dozens of different techniques that someone could use to train their Pokemon, so if this one doesn't work for you, that's fine. This is just the way that I saw that seemed the easiest to me. Remember to always consult with a flying type professional before just going out and getting any flying type Pokemon. Oh, and one last point that I want to mention. Always feed your Spearow before you let it fly. That will help to avoid it from hunting while out flying around. The last thing you need is someone upset that your Spearow swooped down out of the sky and gobbled up their kid's bug Pokemon. It's a legal nightmare. Cost. A lot of the funds that you're going to be throwing at this Pokemon are going to be tied up in the enclosure. A Spearow's enclosure is going to have to be custom built. And even if you build it yourself and don't hire a company to do it, just the materials needed to build it will put you squarely in the very high category. Even just buying the enclosure for Spearow, the smaller ones that you can put in your house will be in the high category. Mix in the training equipment you'll need, and it will end up being a pretty penny. It's an unfortunate and unavoidable cost of housing a flying type. Luckily, those high costs from the enclosure are offset by the costs of everything else. The Pokemon itself, for example, will be in the low, or even the very low category. I mean, really, you could just go out and try and catch one, but I really don't recommend that because of the aggressiveness that they can show. And if an entire flock comes after you, then you're toast. So it would most likely be better for you to get one from a breeder, and luckily they're readily available. While they may not be as common as something like Pidgey, there is definitely a surplus of them in the Pokemon market at the moment. Even if you want to get a Spearow instead of a Spearow, you could easily do that. Unlike the later evolutions of Pidgey, Spearow can be housed together without causing problems, so more breeders have them for sale. They even tend to come pre-trained. Though, if you want a Spearow, then the price will probably jump up to the moderate or even the high category. But that's what you have to consider if you want to spend a bit of extra money for a pre-trained Pokemon. I know I wouldn't have the patience to train a flying type Pokemon myself. The last thing that we need to talk about is food. Like I said, for this species, I would recommend Caterpie through both evolutions. That should easily keep the food price in the moderate category. Like I said in earlier episodes, Caterpie are easy to raise, plentiful in many different places around the world, and are sold by thousands of breeders all around the world every year. All of this will help keep the price lower for you. Ordering in bulk from wherever you're ordering them from will also help keep the price down, as you can usually get a discount for ordering that way. Really, you could even start raising your own Caterpie to use as feeders, but I understand that isn't for everyone. But no matter what you do, the price of your food shouldn't be too much in the long run. Conclusion. Personally, after going through Spearow and how to raise and care for them, I would only recommend these Pokemon for those that are more experienced in raising the stubborn kind of Pokemon. If you're a new Pokemon owner, then I would go for something that's a bit more easy to handle. But other than that, I think the Spearow line are great Pokemon. Strong, tenacious, and to those trainers that have earned their trust, they can be very loving and protective. For those that are willing to put in the work to get to that point with one of these Pokemon, then you might just find that these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Be sure to catch the next episode where we go over the slippery snake Pokemon Ekans and Arbok. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.